Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It began like any other night, or so I thought. My parents had gone to visit a neighbor's house on the far side of the village. I had spent the evening playing with my friends near the stream, laughing and running until the sky turned dark. The laughter faded with the setting sun, replaced by the soft hum of crickets and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I wasn't scared of the dark, not usually, but that night something felt different. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A thick mist had started rolling in, curling around the trees and spilling over the path like a creeping shadow. I could barely see past my own hands. The shortcut through the woods was supposed to save time. It was an old path, barely used anymore, winding through the densest part of the forest. It wasn't my first time taking it, but tonight it felt off. I hesitated at the entrance, staring at the arch of gnarled trees that marked the beginning of the trail. "Come on, it's just fog," I muttered to myself, gripping the handle of my lantern. The flame inside flickered nervously, as if it shared my unease. The first few steps into the woods were quiet, save for the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The lantern's light swayed with my movements, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to dance and whisper just beyond the edges of my vision. The trees were tall and old, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers, blotting out what little moonlight might have guided me. I kept my pace steady, humming a tune under my breath to drown out the eerie silence. The mist thickened, wrapping around my ankles and swirling up like smoke. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. Soft rustling, maybe, or the faint snap of a twig. "It's just the wind," I told myself, though my heart was beginning to race. The path ahead looked endless, swallowed by the fog. It felt like the deeper I went, the more the forest closed in around me. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just a shadow cast by the swaying branches. But no, it was something else. A figure stood in the middle of the path, barely visible through the mist. My steps faltered, and I tightened my grip on the lantern. The figure didn't move. It was tall, wrapped in something dark and tattered, its face completely hidden. My chest tightened as I stared at it, my mind racing. Who would be standing out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and thin. The figure didn't respond. It simply raised an arm and pointed at something behind me. I froze. My blood turned cold. Slowly, I turned my head, dreading what I might see. The mist swirled thickly behind me, but there was nothing there, just the empty fog-covered path. When I looked back, the figure was gone. A shiver ran down my spine. My hands trembled as I clutched the lantern tighter. My first instinct was to run, to turn around and get out of the woods as fast as I could. But something kept me rooted to the spot. A strange, inexplicable pull. "It's just your imagination," I whispered, trying to calm myself. "You're tired, that's all." I forced my legs to move, one shaky step at a time, past the spot where the figure had been. The mist seemed thicker now, clinging to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The further I walked, the heavier the air became. It was hard to breathe, and my chest felt tight, like something unseen was pressing down on me. The lantern's light flickered again, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it might go out. That's when I heard it, a faint, ragged breathing. It was soft at first, almost like the sound of wind stirring the leaves. But then it grew louder, more distinct. Slow, uneven breaths, as if someone, or something, was struggling to draw air. My heart pounded in my chest. I stopped walking, straining to hear. The breathing seemed to be coming from behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't heard it. But curiosity, or maybe fear, got the better of me. I turned slowly, the lantern held out in front of me. Its dim light barely pierced the fog. I scanned the path, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. But there was nothing there. The breathing stopped. I stood frozen, my ears straining for any sound. The silence was oppressive, almost deafening. It pressed down on me like a weight, making it hard to think, hard to move. Then, just as I was about to turn back around, the breathing started again. This time, it was louder, closer. My stomach churned as I realized the sound wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was coming from above. Slowly, as if in a dream, I tilted my head upward. The lantern's light swung toward the trees, illuminating the gnarled branches overhead. And there it was. The figure hung above me, its tattered cloak blending into the shadows of the branches. Its face was still hidden, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, locked onto me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, save for that awful, ragged breathing. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the damp path as I sprinted blindly through the fog. The lantern's light bounced wildly, casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at me. The breathing followed, growing louder and more frantic, as if it was right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran and ran, my lungs burning and my legs trembling, until I finally burst out of the woods and onto the main road. The mist was thinner here, and the faint glow of the village lights was just visible in the distance. I collapsed onto my knees, gasping for air, clutching the lantern like a lifeline. The breathing had stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the soft rustle of the wind. I looked back toward the woods, half expecting to see the figure standing there watching me. But the path was empty. I got to my feet, my legs shaky, and started walking toward the village as fast as I could. I didn't look back again, not even when I thought I heard faint footsteps trailing behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. The image of that figure, hanging in the trees, burned itself into my mind. Even now, I can't walk past those woods without feeling a cold chill run down my spine. Something was out there in the mist, waiting, watching, and I knew, deep down, that it wasn't finished with me yet. The next morning, I awoke to the muffled sounds of the village coming to life outside my window. The faint chatter of voices, the creak of cartwheels on cobblestones, and the rhythmic thud of someone chopping wood seemed almost surreal after the horrors of the previous night. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. The mist, the figure, the suffocating sense of dread. But the lantern on my bedside table told a different story. Its glass was smudged with dirt, and the faint smell of charred oil still lingered. I stared at it for a long time, the events of the night before replaying in my mind like a half-remembered nightmare. I could hear my mother bustling around downstairs, humming a familiar tune. Her voice was a comforting anchor to the world I knew, the world I understood. Yet even that felt distant now, like I was caught in some in-between place where reality and something darker overlapped. The village itself seemed unchanged when I finally ventured outside. The morning sun had burned away the mist, and the cobblestone streets were bustling with familiar faces. Mrs. Hargrove was sweeping her front steps, pausing occasionally to exchange pleasantries with passers-by. Old Mr. Cray sat on his usual bench near the well, whittling away at a block of wood. Everything was as it should be, or so it seemed. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I made my way to the baker's shop, the feeling of unease grew stronger. People smiled and nodded as I passed, but their faces seemed strangely hollow, their eyes distant. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tension that simmered just beneath the surface. "Morning, Eli," called Mr. Whitaker, the baker, as I stepped into his shop. His flour-dusted hands worked deftly to knead a lump of dough, his usual cheerful demeanor firmly in place. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. The warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread filled the air, but even that couldn't calm the knot in my stomach. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mr. Whitaker remarked, chuckling. I hesitated. "I didn't sleep well." "Ah, those woods can do that to you," he said, his tone light. "Something about them always feels unsettled, doesn't it? Especially when the mist rolls in." I stared at him, my heart skipping a beat. "You felt it too?" He paused, his hands stilling for just a moment before he resumed kneading. "Oh, everyone has, I suppose. Just one of those things, you know. Best not to dwell on it." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to press him, to ask what he meant, but something in his expression warned me against it. I paid for the loaf of bread and left the shop, the bell over the door jangling softly behind me. The unease that had been gnawing at me all morning now felt like a full-blown storm brewing in my chest. As I walked back toward home, I noticed something odd. The villagers were whispering to one another in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the woods at the edge of the village. Every now and then, someone would glance at me, their expression unreadable. By the time I reached my house, my nerves were frayed. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to tell someone. "Mom," I called out as I stepped inside. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it, Eli?" I hesitated. How could I even begin to explain what I had seen? "Something happened last night," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "In the woods." Her expression changed immediately. The warmth in her eyes was replaced by something colder, sharper. She stepped closer, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "You took the shortcut?" she asked, her tone carefully measured. I nodded, suddenly feeling like a child who had been caught doing something forbidden. Her gaze flicked toward the window, toward the distant line of trees. "Eli, listen to me. You must never go into those woods after dark. Do you understand?" "I didn't have a choice," I protested. "It was late, and I thought, it doesn't matter what you thought." She interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "There are things in those woods that you can't understand, things that don't belong in this world." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, busying herself with the dishes. But her hands were shaking, and I could see the tension in her shoulders. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and twist, forming shapes that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. The silence of the house was broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards and the occasional sigh of the wind outside. Around midnight I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping at the window. I froze, my heart pounding. The tapping came again, louder this time. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just outside. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It felt like I was trapped in some awful dream, unable to wake up. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice, low and hollow, barely more than a whisper, spoke from the other side of the glass. "Eli." My breath caught in my throat. "Eli, come outside." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. "You can't hide from me, Eli." The voice continued, soft and insistent. I'm always watching. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to scream for my parents, but the words wouldn't come. Suddenly the voice stopped. The air grew still, heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. When I finally worked up the courage to open my eyes, the figure was gone. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. My father's face darkened, and my mother looked like she was on the verge of tears. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. My father nodded grimly. "Pack what you can. We'll go before nightfall." As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the village grew more tense. The whispers grew louder, and the glances became more pointed. It felt like everyone knew something they weren't telling me. By evening, we were packed and ready to go. My father hitched the wagon, and my mother loaded our belongings. I stood by the door, clutching the lantern that had guided me through the woods. As we prepared to leave, a group of villagers gathered near our house. They didn't speak or move. They simply watched, their faces pale and their eyes full of something I couldn't quite identify. Fear. As the wagon rolled down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The trees loomed tall and dark on either side, their branches stretching toward us like skeletal hands. And then I heard it again, that awful, ragged breathing. I turned, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching behind us, swallowed by the shadows. But I knew it was there, watching, waiting. And I knew deep down that we couldn't outrun it. The road stretched out before us, seemingly endless, the wheels of the wagon creaking with every bump and rut. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, but it did nothing to alleviate the gnawing unease that gripped me. I sat next to my mother, clutching the edge of the wagon as though it might somehow shield me from what lurked in the woods behind us. My father drove the horses, his face a mask of determination, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands tightened around the reins. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the wheels and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But then, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper in the distance. "Eli." The voice drifted on the wind, low and insistent. It was unmistakable. I'd heard it before, just outside my window, but this time it was different. It felt closer, more real, as if it was right behind us. I turned my head sharply, scanning the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods were dark and oppressive, their shadows long and stretched across the road like a cloak. But there was nothing there, nothing that I could see. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my mother. She didn't answer right away. She simply stared ahead, her face pale and drawn. Her lips trembled slightly, but she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, as though if she didn't acknowledge the voice, it would go away. But I knew better. "I heard it too," she said finally, her voice trembling. "It's the same voice you heard last night." A cold chill ran down my spine. "It's following us." "We can't outrun it," she murmured, her words barely audible over the sound of the wagon. "We've never been able to outrun it." My father's voice cut through the silence. "Keep your eyes forward. We'll be in the town by nightfall. Just focus on getting there." But it wasn't enough. The air had shifted, heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. I could feel it pressing in from all sides, an unseen weight that seemed to grow stronger with each passing mile. I knew something was out there, something waiting for us to slip up, to falter. As we neared the edge of the village, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The trees seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, casting long, jagged shadows across the road. The sky above had darkened, and the air was thick with the scent of impending rain. The familiar landscape now seemed foreign, hostile. I glanced at my parents, hoping to find some reassurance in their faces. But what I saw instead was fear, a fear that mirrored my own. "We need to turn back," I said, my voice shaking. "This is a mistake. We should have never left." My father looked over at me, his brow furrowed. "We're almost there, Eli. Just a little longer." But it was clear that even he didn't believe his own words. His grip on the reins tightened, and I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. We reached the outskirts of the village as dusk began to fall. The last remnants of sunlight had disappeared behind the hills, leaving the world cloaked in shadow. The houses along the road were dark, their windows shuttered. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. My mother turned to me, her face pale and grim. "Eli, listen to me. We need to go to the old church. It's the only place that might be safe." The church. I had forgotten about it, buried it deep in my mind along with all the other things I didn't want to remember. The church had always been a place of refuge, a place where the village's elders gathered to discuss the things they could never speak of openly. But it was also a place of strange rituals and whispered secrets, a place where, as a child, I had been warned never to go after dark. We turned off the main road, following the narrow path that led to the church. As we passed the last of the village houses, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The presence was closer now, its weight unbearable, pressing down on us like a vice. The church came into view, its stone walls dark and weathered, the tall spire reaching into the sky like a finger pointing toward some unseen force. It stood at the edge of the woods, isolated and forgotten, a silent sentinel watching over the village. When we reached the church, my father pulled the wagon to a stop. We all climbed down, but none of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The silence between us was thick with fear, a fear that I could taste in the air. "We'll go inside," my mother said, her voice steady but strained. "It's the only place we can go." The heavy wooden door creaked as we pushed it open, the smell of incense and age-old stone filling the air. Inside, the church was dimly lit by the glow of a few scattered candles. The pews were empty, save for a single figure standing at the altar. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The figure was tall, draped in a dark cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps echoing in the silence. "You've come," it said, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. My father stepped in front of us, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure's voice was calm, almost soothing. "I am the one you have been running from, the one who has always been watching." The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath in the air. The candles flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe like living things. "Why are you doing this?" my mother cried, her voice breaking. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head, its voice still as calm as before. "I want nothing from you. I simply want you to understand that you cannot escape what you are. You cannot outrun your fate." The words sent a chill through my bones. I turned to my parents, but their faces were ashen, their eyes wide with terror. It was as though they had known this moment would come, had been preparing for it their entire lives. "We've tried to protect you," my father said, his voice low and filled with regret. "But we can't anymore." The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "There is no escaping what you have become, Eli. You are part of this. Always have been." I shook my head, my mind racing. No, you're wrong." But deep down, I knew it was true. I had always known there was something different about me, something strange and unexplainable. The dreams, the voices, the pull toward the woods, it had all been leading to this moment. The figure raised its hand, and the shadows in the room seemed to converge around us, pressing in from all sides. I could feel them, thick and heavy, wrapping around me like chains. "This is where it ends," the figure said, its voice final. "The past and future converge here, in the darkness." And then, just as quickly as it had come, the presence faded, the shadows lifted, the temperature returned to normal, and the church was silent once more. The figure was gone, vanished into thin air. We stood there stunned, unable to comprehend what had just happened. My father was the first to speak. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "It's over." I first saw the hillside lodge from my car window as I drove up the winding road that led into the forest. The sky was overcast, the late afternoon light muted by thick clouds. The lodge sat at the end of a narrow gravel driveway, partially hidden by tall, gnarled trees that surrounded it on all sides. It was an old building, its weathered wooden exterior faded to a dull gray. The place had an air of forgotten grandeur, as if it had once been something special, but had long since fallen into neglect. Despite its appearance, I had chosen the lodge for practical reasons. It was close to the venue for my meeting, and it fit within my modest budget. My heart was set on making this business trip a success. I parked my car and stepped out, the cool air biting at my skin. The wind carried the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth, mingled with something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. The lodge loomed ahead, its windows dark and uninviting. For a moment, I hesitated, my instincts urging me to turn back. But I shook off the feeling and grabbed my suitcase from the trunk. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and I was greeted by the faint smell of polish and dust. The lobby was dimly lit, with a large, ornate chandelier hanging above a faded red carpet. The furniture was mismatched, a collection of worn armchairs and antique side tables that gave the room a disjointed feel. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its pendulum swinging slowly, its rhythmic ticking echoing faintly in the otherwise silent space. Behind the reception desk stood a middle-aged woman with short, graying hair. Her smile was polite but strained, as if she'd been rehearsing it for years. "Welcome to Hillside Lodge," she said, her voice calm but devoid of warmth. "Thank you," I replied, placing my suitcase down. "I have a reservation, named Samuel Carter." She typed something into an old computer that hummed loudly, its screen flickering slightly. "Ah, yes, Mr. Carter. Room 313, third floor. Here's your key." She handed me an actual key, heavy, brass, and attached to a large wooden tag with the room number carved into it. "The elevator is to your right." I nodded, took the key, and turned toward the elevator. As I waited for the ancient machine to descend, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the lobby was. No music, no other guests, just the ticking of the grandfather clock. The elevator doors opened with a groan, and I stepped inside. The interior was cramped and smelled faintly of oil. I pressed the button for the third floor and watched as the doors closed, sealing me in. The ride was slow, the elevator jolting slightly as it climbed. I found myself staring at the worn buttons, each one scratched and discolored, wondering how long this machine had been in service. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by a long, dimly lit hallway. The carpet here was the same faded red as in the lobby, but the walls were lined with dark wood paneling that made the space feel narrow and oppressive. The air was still, carrying a faint musty smell that made me wrinkle my nose. My room, 313, was near the end of the hallway. As I approached, I noticed that the numbers on the doors were slightly uneven, as if they had been hastily replaced at some point. When I reached my room, I paused, the weight of the brass key heavy in my hand. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed pushed against one wall, a small wooden desk and chair, and a wardrobe that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The bedspread was a dull beige color, and the curtains, thick and heavy, hung limply over the single window. The air inside the room was cold, and I quickly turned on the heater, which sputtered to life with a low hum. I set my suitcase down by the wardrobe and walked over to the window. Pushing aside the curtains, I looked out at the forest. The trees were tall and closely packed, their dark silhouettes swaying gently in the wind. Beyond them, the sky was growing darker, the clouds thickening as night approached. I turned away from the window and sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing my hands together to warm them. Despite the heater, the room still felt chilly, and I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over me since I arrived. To distract myself, I unpacked my belongings and set up my laptop on the desk. I had some work to review for the meeting tomorrow, and I wanted to make sure everything was in order. The glow of the laptop screen provided a small comfort, a reminder of the modern world outside this isolated lodge. After an hour or so of working, I decided to call it a night. I changed into my pajamas and brushed my teeth in the small bathroom, which was surprisingly clean, but dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. As I washed my face, I thought I heard a faint creak from somewhere outside the room. I paused, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Back in the bedroom, I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin. The mattress was lumpy, and the pillow felt too thin, but I was too tired to care. I turned off the lamp on the nightstand, plunging the room into darkness. For a while, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts about the meeting. But as the minutes ticked by, my thoughts began to slow, and my eyelids grew heavy. Just as I was about to drift off, I thought I heard something, a faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming against wood. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly racing. The room was silent, the only sound the low hum of the heater. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I closed my eyes tightly and forced myself to focus on my breathing, trying to calm the unease that had taken hold of me. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. Looking back, I wish I had paid more attention to those first signs, the tapping, the unease, the cold that seemed to seep into my bones. But at the time, I had no idea what was to come. This was just the beginning. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, the heavy curtains blocking out what little moonlight might have filtered through the overcast sky. For a moment, I lay still, unsure of what had woken me. My mind felt sluggish, caught in the haze between sleep and wakefulness. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was faint, yet unmistakable, like fingernails gently rapping against wood. It was coming from the direction of the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted to the window, but it was too dark to see anything. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on the room. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps a branch brushing against the glass. That had to be it. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize the sound, but a deeper, more primal part of me knew something wasn't right. Summoning my courage, I reached for the lamp on the nightstand and flicked it on. The warm glow flooded the room, banishing the shadows to the corners. I turned my head slowly toward the window. The curtains were drawn, the thick fabric undisturbed. The sound had stopped the moment the light came on. I sat there for several minutes, my ears straining for any sign of movement, but the room remained silent. Finally, I let out a shaky breath and shook my head, chastising myself for being so jumpy. "It's just the wind," I muttered under my breath, though the words felt hollow. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. With a quick tug, I pulled the curtains aside. The glass was fogged from the cold, but I could see the outline of the forest beyond. The trees stood still, their branches motionless in the night air. There was no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. Feeling foolish, I closed the curtains and climbed back into bed. The heater hummed softly, its warmth a small comfort against the lingering chill in the room. I told myself to forget about the sound and go back to sleep. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a fitful sleep. The next morning, the lodge felt different. The oppressive silence that had filled the place the night before was gone, replaced by the faint sounds of movement and voices. It was almost reassuring, as if the daylight had chased away whatever had unsettled me in the dark. I dressed quickly and headed downstairs to the dining area for breakfast. The room was small and sparsely decorated, with a few wooden tables and chairs scattered about. A buffet table along one wall held an assortment of pastries, fruit, and a coffee pot that looked like it had seen better days. A handful of other guests were seated at the tables, chatting quietly over their meals. I felt a sense of relief at the sight of them. It was easy to let your imagination run wild when you were alone in a strange place, but seeing other people made everything feel more grounded. I grabbed a cup of coffee and a slice of toast and took a seat by the window. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, the morning light casting long shadows across the trees. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was something about the dense woods that still made me uneasy. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed the receptionist from the previous night walking through the dining area. She paused at each table, exchanging pleasantries with the guests. When she reached me, she offered the same polite but strained smile I'd seen before. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said. "I trust you slept well?" Her tone was friendly enough, but there was an edge to her words, as if she already knew the answer. "Not really," I admitted. "I kept hearing strange noises during the night. It sounded like tapping on my window." Her smile faltered for just a moment, so quickly that I almost missed it. "This old place has its quirks," she said. "The wind can play tricks on you, especially at night." I nodded, though her explanation didn't entirely satisfy me. There was something in her expression that suggested she wasn't telling the whole truth. Before I could press her further, she moved on to the next table, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I spent the morning at my meeting, which went well enough, and returned to the lodge in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, casting the forest in hues of gold and orange. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. There was a narrow path behind the lodge that led into the woods, and I followed it for a while, enjoying the fresh air and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional rustle of branches and the distant call of a bird. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but the path behind me was empty. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their dark trunks stretching toward the sky. I told myself it was just paranoia, a leftover feeling from the restless night before. But as I turned to head back to the lodge, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees. I stopped, my heart racing, and stared into the forest. The shadows shifted as the wind picked up, but there was nothing there. Shaking my head, I quickened my pace and hurried back to the lodge. That night, the tapping returned. It started just after I turned off the light, faint at first, but growing louder and more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the lamp and turned it on, flooding the room with light. The tapping stopped instantly, but this time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I got out of bed and marched to the window, determined to find the source of the noise. Pulling the curtains aside, I peered out into the darkness. The glass was fogged again, but as I wiped it clean with my hand, my breath caught in my throat. A handprint. It was faint but unmistakable, a smudge of condensation in the shape of a hand pressed against the outside of the glass. My stomach turned to ice. The window was on the third floor. I stumbled back, my mind racing. There was no way someone could have reached the window without a ladder or some kind of equipment, but the handprint was there, clear as day. I grabbed my phone and dialed the reception desk. The line rang several times before the receptionist answered, her voice groggy. "Hello? This is Samuel Carter in room 313, I said, my voice trembling. "Someone's outside my window." There was a pause on the other end, and then she said, "Are you sure, Mr. Carter? The windows on the upper floors don't open, and there's no access to them from the outside." "I'm looking at a handprint on the glass," I snapped. "I didn't imagine it." Her tone shifted, becoming colder. "I'll send someone up to check. Please stay in your room." The call ended abruptly, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, my eyes fixed on the window, waiting for someone to arrive. Minutes passed, but no one came. Then, just as I was about to call again, the tapping started once more. This time it wasn't at the window. It was coming from the wardrobe. The sound of the tapping, now coming from the wardrobe, froze me in place. My pulse raced as I stared at the wooden doors, their polished surface reflecting the dim light of the bedside lamp. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that I had misheard it, that the sound wasn't coming from inside the wardrobe. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the room, to get as far away from that sound as possible. Yet something rooted me in place, a terrible mix of fear and curiosity. I needed, to know what was behind those doors. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached for the wardrobe. My hand trembled as I gripped the cold brass handle. I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. What if something, or someone, was inside? What would I do then? The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an eerie silence. It was as if whatever was on the other side knew I was about to open the door and was waiting for me to make the next move. I pulled the doors open in one swift motion. The wardrobe was empty. The neatly hung clothes and spare blankets stared back at me, utterly mundane and devoid of anything that could have caused the noise. My initial relief was quickly replaced by confusion and a growing sense of unease. I reached into the wardrobe, pushing aside the hanging garments, but found nothing unusual. I stepped back, closing the doors carefully, as if doing so might somehow contain whatever was lurking in the room. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. My eyes flicked to the window, where the faint outline of the handprint still lingered on the fogged glass. I couldn't stay here. Grabbing my coat, I decided to head downstairs. I needed answers, or at least the reassurance of being around other people. The lobby was eerily quiet when I arrived. The reception desk was unmanned, and the only sound was the faint hum of the heater. I rang the bell on the counter, the sharp chime echoing through the empty space. No one came. A sense of isolation crept over me. The lodge, which had seemed so lively earlier in the day, now felt like a ghost town. I was about to ring the bell again when I heard a noise coming from the lounge area to my left. It was faint, like whispers carried on the wind. I followed the sound, my footsteps hesitant on the creaking floorboards. The lounge was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the dying embers of a fire in the hearth. The room was empty, but the whispers continued, low and unintelligible. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The whispers stopped. I turned toward the source of the sound, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, moving across the far wall. It didn't belong to anything in the room. It moved unnaturally, sliding along the surface like water, its shape shifting and twisting. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow seemed to notice me. It froze for a moment, then began to move toward me, stretching and elongating as it crossed the room. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay back!" I shouted, though I had no idea what I was dealing with or how to stop it. The shadow reached the edge of the room and began to rise, forming into a humanoid shape. Its head tilted as if observing me, though it had no discernible features. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from all directions, it spoke. Why are you here? The words sent a chill through me. I opened my mouth to reply but found that I couldn't speak. Leave this place, it said. You do not belong. The shadow began to advance, its form growing larger and more menacing. Desperation took over, and I turned and ran. I bolted back toward the reception area, my mind racing. The lodge felt like a maze, the hallways stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Doors appeared where they hadn't been before, and the layout seemed to shift with every turn I took. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself in the dining area. It was empty, the tables and chairs eerily still, as if frozen in time. I spotted the emergency exit at the far end of the room and made a beeline for it. My only thought to get out of the lodge and into the open air. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, but it was as if it had been welded shut. Panic clawed at my chest as I turned to look back at the room. The shadow was there, standing in the doorway I had just come through. You cannot escape, it said, its voice low and resonant. I backed away, my hands trembling. What do you want from me? I shouted. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it began to shift again, collapsing into a pool of darkness that spread across the floor. It moved like liquid, flowing toward me with a horrifying purpose. I climbed onto one of the tables, desperate to put some distance between myself and the encroaching darkness. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. Then I remembered the fire. The embers in the hearth might still be hot enough to light something. I grabbed a chair and smashed it against the floor, breaking off one of its legs. Holding the makeshift club in one hand, I leapt off the table and ran toward the fireplace. The shadow surged after me, its tendrils reaching out like grasping hands. I reached the hearth and plunged the chair leg into the embers, twisting it until the end caught fire. The flames sputtered to life, small but bright in the dim room. The shadow recoiled, hissing like steam. I turned to face it, holding the burning wood in front of me like a torch. Stay back, I shouted, my voice steadier now. The shadow hesitated, its form flickering and unstable. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. You don't belong here either, I said, my words bold even as fear still gripped me. Leave. The shadow let out a guttural roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the lodge. It surged forward one last time, but I thrust the flaming wood toward it, the heat and light driving it back. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the shadow dissolved, its form dissipating into thin air. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting as if a great weight had been removed. I didn't stay to see what might happen next. Dropping the charred wood, I ran back through the lodge, this time finding the layout familiar and unchanged. I reached the front door and threw it open, stepping out into the cold night air. The forest was still and quiet, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The next morning I filed a report with the local authorities, though I left out the more supernatural elements of the story. They promised to investigate the lodge, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever had been there was gone, or at least I hoped it was. I left the area that same day, vowing never to return. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened in that lodge. Was it a ghost? A demon? Or something else entirely? I don't know. All I know is that I survived, and that's enough. Let me tell you a story about a night I will never forget. It's a little scary, but don't worry, I'll be here with you. You know, I've always loved walking outside at night. There's something about the cool air, the quiet streets, and the peaceful sound of the wind that makes it my favorite time to walk. But what happened to me one night was so strange, it still gives me chills when I think about it. So, let me start from the beginning. My name is Jasper, and I'm not really the biggest or toughest guy. I'm only 5'6", and I'm not all that strong either. But there's one thing that makes me feel safe when I go out. My dog, Max. Max is a big dog, and people often get scared when they see him because he's 110 pounds of pure muscle. He's got black fur and golden eyes, and he looks pretty fierce. But the truth is, Max is a big softie. He's really friendly once you get to know him. The thing about Max is, he's very protective of me, and I trust him completely. I usually walk Max around the park near our house. It's a nice park, quiet and peaceful, especially after the sun goes down. There's something special about it at night. Everything feels a little calmer, and I like how the trees cast shadows across the path. Sometimes I even listen to music while I walk, but that night I decided not to. My phone was about to die, and I wanted to save the battery, so I decided to just enjoy the walk with Max in silence. We started our usual route, and everything felt normal. Max sniffed around, did his business in the grass, and we kept walking along the path. The park wasn't too crowded at that time, just a couple of joggers, maybe a few other dog walkers. But as we went deeper into the park, it started getting darker and darker. I looked around and the park was almost completely empty. I didn't think much of it though. This park was always quiet at night, but something started to feel off. I couldn't explain it. My heart started to beat faster, and I felt like someone was watching us. I'm the kind of person who gets nervous sometimes, but I told myself I was just being silly. After all, this was a safe neighborhood, and nothing bad ever happened around here. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked around, trying to find anything that might explain why I felt so uneasy. But there was no one. The park was empty, and all I could hear was the soft crunch of leaves under our feet. Max walked beside me, his ears perked up, and his eyes darted around. I thought maybe he was just being cautious, like usual, but then he stopped walking completely. I looked down at him. Max was staring behind us with wide eyes, his tail tucked between his legs. Now, Max is a brave dog, and he's never scared of anything. But in that moment, he looked terrified. He started to growl low in his throat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "What is it, Max?" I whispered. I couldn't see anything, but I felt a sense of dread. I tried to pull Max along, but he didn't move. He just stood there, growling louder. I was starting to feel scared too. Max wasn't acting like this for no reason, and I didn't want to find out what it was. So, I tugged on his leash, trying to get him to walk again. But then, something strange happened. Max turned his head to look behind us again, his growl getting louder, and he started barking. My heart raced. What was going on? I turned around, shining my flashlight on the path, but all I saw were trees. Just trees. No one was there. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal or something, but Max wasn't calming down. He was still growling, still barking. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps. They were soft at first, like someone walking slowly through the leaves, but they were getting closer. And then I heard the snap of a branch, and my stomach dropped. This wasn't an animal. "Max," I whispered. "What is it?" I turned around to face whatever was out there, and that's when I saw him. A man, stepping out from behind the trees. He was tall, maybe in his early 50s, with gray hair and a dirty jacket. His clothes were old and torn, and his shoes looked like they had been worn for years. He had one hand in his pocket, and when he saw us, he smiled. "Hey, nice dog," he said, his voice raspy. "Can I pet him?" I froze. Something about the man's voice made my skin crawl. Max barked again, louder this time, and ran behind me, still growling. I could feel his body shaking. He wasn't just being protective, he was scared, really scared. "No, I don't think that's a good idea," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice calm. "My dog doesn't really like strangers." But the man didn't listen. He took a step closer, and I could see his eyes. His pupils were so small, like he was focused on something deep inside of me. I took a step back, but the man kept coming closer, almost like he didn't hear me. "Please, I just want to pet him," he said again, his voice getting a little more urgent. I knew I had to get out of there. I didn't care about being polite anymore. This man was making me nervous, and Max clearly didn't trust him either. I turned around and started walking away quickly, but the man didn't stop. He started walking faster, matching my pace. "Hey!" he shouted. "Come back here! I just want to pet your dog." I looked behind me, and I could see him getting closer, too close. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what he wanted, but I had a feeling it wasn't just about the dog. I didn't want to find out. I started to run, and Max followed. We sprinted down the path as fast as we could. The man's footsteps behind us were getting louder, closer. I could hear him breathing heavily, and I was terrified. Why was he chasing us? What did he want? I looked over my shoulder and saw him not far behind, his eyes locked on us like he was hunting. I didn't know how long I could keep running. But then, just as I was starting to lose hope, the path ahead opened up, and I could see the exit of the park. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't dare look back again. We burst out of the park and into the street, where there were more lights, more cars, and more people. I kept running until I knew I was safe. I didn't stop until I got home. I kept checking behind me, making sure no one was following, but I never saw him again. That night, I made a police report about the man. They said they would check the park, but they never found him. I don't know what that man wanted or what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away, but I'll never walk Max in that park again at night. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts, or if I had been wearing headphones and hadn't heard him coming. But I'm glad I was paying attention, and I'm glad Max was there to protect me. So kids, if you ever feel like something's not right, trust your feelings. Always pay attention to the world around you, and never be afraid to leave when things feel off. Because sometimes there are people out there who don't have good intentions, and you might be the only one who can keep yourself safe. Always listen to your dog, and always trust your gut. Hi, my name is Riley, and I want to tell you a story about something strange that happened to me a few years ago. It all started when I decided to sell an old couch. I had just bought a new one, and I really didn't need the old one anymore. It was still decent, but definitely a bit worn out. My friends always joked that it had seen better days, but I thought it still had some life left in it. I had bought it for about $800 a few years ago. It was a really nice couch back then, but now it wasn't in the best shape. I thought it would be worth around $250, maybe $200, so I decided to put it up on Craigslist. I didn't expect it to sell immediately, but I figured I could find someone who would be happy to buy it. I put the ad up for $300, thinking I'd settle for $200 at the lowest. Days went by and I didn't hear much from anyone. People messaged me and said they were interested, but then they'd disappear, like they never even contacted me. It was frustrating, but I kept the ad up, hoping someone would finally get serious. Then, about a week after I posted it, I got a message from a guy named Alex. He said he was interested in the couch and wanted to come look at it later that evening after work. I agreed, and we set a time for him to stop by. I gave him my address and waited. I didn't expect him to come so soon, but an hour later, there was a knock on my door. I was confused because I was expecting him much later. I peeked through the peephole and saw a man standing there, holding a jacket over his shoulder. He looked average, wearing a blue shirt and jeans, with short brown hair. He didn't look like anyone I knew, but I wasn't sure if I should let him in just yet. "Hello?" I called through the door. "Who's there?" "It's Alex," he replied, his voice friendly. "I'm here to look at the couch. Sorry, I know I'm a bit early. I just got off work." I opened the door slowly, feeling a little uneasy but trying to stay calm. I told him to come in and showed him the couch. He looked at it for a moment and then asked, "Would you take $150 for it?" I was taken aback. The couch was in decent shape, and I was already offering it for $300. I told him the lowest I could go was $200, but he seemed disappointed and a little annoyed. "Fine," he said with a sigh. I'll take it for $200. But before we talk about the payment, do you mind if I use your bathroom? It's a long drive back to my place. I didn't mind, so I pointed him down the hall to the bathroom and went back to sit on the couch, waiting. As soon as he left the room, though, I started to feel nervous. It wasn't anything specific, just a strange feeling that I couldn't shake. I thought I was just being paranoid, so I tried to relax and not think too much about it. A few minutes later, Alex came back out of the bathroom, and I couldn't believe the change in him. His whole attitude was different. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, serious expression. The way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it was like I was talking to a completely different person. "You're going to give me the couch for $150, or I'll take it from you," Alex said, his voice low and threatening. I was so shocked, I didn't know how to respond. Before I could even say anything, the door burst open, and 2 more men stepped inside. They were both holding knives, and they didn't look friendly at all. My heart raced. I couldn't move. I started to panic, my thoughts racing. What should I do? What was happening? I begged them not to hurt me, to just take the couch and leave. I didn't want trouble. I told them I wouldn't call the cops, that I just wanted to be left alone. One of the men came closer and looked at me, his eyes cold and hard. "This is your last chance," he said. "Give us the couch or things will get ugly." I was shaking so much I could barely speak. I told them over and over that I would do whatever they wanted. Just please, don't hurt me. After what felt like hours, they finally nodded, and without saying another word, they started dragging the couch toward the door. I was too scared to do anything. I just watched as they carried it out of my house. The man who had started the whole thing, Alex, looked at me one last time and said, "Thanks for the couch. You don't need it anymore." Then they were gone. I stood there frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. I couldn't believe it. What was their plan? What if I had tried to fight back? I don't know what would have happened. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house anymore. A few days later, my wife, Lila, and I decided to move. We found a new place, far away from that town, and tried to put the whole thing behind us. It's been a few years now, and I still don't understand what those men wanted or why they acted like that. But sometimes when I think back, I wonder, was it just about the couch? Or was there something more? I've never seen those men again, and I hope I never do. Hey, my name is Elias, and I want to share a story with you that still gives me chills. It happened a few summers ago when I was 14. I loved camping, but after what happened to me, I'm not so sure I want to go again. Let me tell you what happened. Every summer, my family would go camping. We had a special place we liked to go to, a big campground in the woods. It wasn't like other campgrounds where the tents and RVs were all lined up in rows. This one had plenty of space between the sites, and there were trails to explore, lots of trees, and plenty of quiet spots where you could just sit and relax. My family had been camping here since I was a little kid, so it felt like home to me. But one summer when I was 14, things felt a little different. It was the first year I was camping there without my best friend, because he had to go to a family reunion, so I was kind of on my own. I didn't mind too much because I was used to hanging out by myself. I had a little sister, but she was only 7, so we didn't have much in common. I spent most of my time riding my bike around the campground, exploring the trails, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. One day, while I was riding my bike near the edge of the campground, I noticed something strange. There was an old cabin that I'd passed by hundreds of times before. It wasn't near any other campsites, and it always looked abandoned. It was tucked away in a part of the woods that didn't get much traffic. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were dirty, and the porch was falling apart. No one ever stayed there. But this time, when I rode by, I noticed something unusual. The door was slightly open. Now, I had passed this cabin plenty of times, and I knew it was always locked up. No one had been there the whole time we'd been camping. I don't know what made me do it, but my curiosity got the best of me. I decided to ride up to the porch and take a closer look. As I slowly rolled up the steps to the cabin, the door creaked as it swayed in the breeze. It was like something straight out of a spooky story, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about turning around, but I didn't. I gently pushed the door open, and as it moved, the sound was so loud in the quiet woods. It was a long, slow creak, and it made my stomach feel like it was turning over. Suddenly, from inside the cabin, I heard a voice. "Who's there?" the voice asked. I froze, wide-eyed, my mouth dry. I didn't know what to do. There, standing in the doorway, was an old man. He was tall and thin, with white hair that hung loosely around his shoulders. His clothes were old and torn, and he looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in ages. His face was wrinkled, and his eyes were sharp and piercing. "Come inside," the man said. "It's fine. Don't be afraid." I wanted to leave, to run back to my campsite, but something in his voice made me hesitate. It felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. Then, just as I was about to turn around, he raised his voice. "Come back," he shouted. I didn't wait around to see what else he wanted. I jumped on my bike and pedaled away as fast as I could, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't stop until I was safely back at our campsite, and I didn't tell anyone what happened. I don't know why, but I just didn't think it was important. The next day, I rode my bike past the cabin again. I was hoping the old man was gone, but there was no sign of him. The cabin was empty, like nothing had happened. It almost felt like it was all in my head, but I knew what I saw, and I knew something wasn't right. That was the last time I thought about it, until the last day of our trip. I was at the campground's arcade, playing a basketball game, when I suddenly heard someone behind me. I turned around, and to my surprise, it was the old man from the cabin. I couldn't believe it. He was standing right beside me, looking down at me with a strange smile on his face. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice low and raspy. "How come you didn't want to hang out with me yesterday?" I didn't know what to say. His smile was wide and crooked, like something you'd see in a nightmare. His teeth were yellow and crooked, and he had a creepy, unsettling way of looking at me. "I'm just kidding," he said, giving me a wink. "You're a clever one, aren't you?" I didn't answer. I just wanted to get away from him. I turned back to the basketball game, trying to focus on something else, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. Finally, he walked away, but I still felt like he was watching me from the corner of my eye. After that, I never saw him again. I never told my parents about what happened either. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe I was too scared, or maybe I just didn't think it was that big of a deal. But now, looking back, I know I was lucky. That man was definitely trying to trick me, and who knows what would have happened if I'd gone inside his cabin or spent more time with him. We left the campground the next day, and I haven't been back since. I'll never forget the way that old man looked at me, and I'll always wonder what his plans were. It's been years now, and I still get a little nervous when I think about it. So, if you ever go camping, be careful about what you find in the woods. Not everything is as innocent as it seems.